first AviaDev Insight Live of 2021. My name is John Howell. I'm the CEO and founder of AviaDev Africa, your African aviation platform dedicated to supporting the development of connectivity to, from, and most importantly, within the African continent. I'm coming to you from Manchester, England, so please do let us know where you are joining us from in the chat function on the right-hand side. This is episode 152. I can hardly believe it's 152, and it's the 5th live episode of the only podcast dedicated to African aviation. So I'd like to warmly welcome our live audience to today's session. Our aim with these sessions is to spend time with some of the leading lights in the industry and to benefit from their knowledge and experience so we can develop a deeper understanding of how our great industry operates and may evolve as a result of the crisis it finds itself in. It's also your opportunity to pose your questions, so thanks to all of you who sent in questions ahead of the session. My very special guest for today's event is Sean Mendis, who I'm sure many of you either know personally, by reputation, or are connected with on social media. Sean was the immediate past Chief Operations Officer at Africa World Airlines, where he served from 2018 to 2020, reprising a role he originally held at the airline startup back in 2010. He has had a 20-year career in aviation management across many different countries, including passenger cargo airlines, ground handling companies, jet fuel providers, and airport management. He specializes in African operations, having successfully started up 3 airlines in the continent since 2005. There's so much more to add, but I'm sure it's going to be touched upon in the next hour or so with our interactions and those of the audience as well. So before we get started, some very quick housekeeping, although I know all of you have been on the webinar before. As usual, only Sean and I will have access to the cameras and audio, so please do use the chat box for comments and the Q&A for any questions you've got, and we'll get to these. For the next hour or so, put your phone on Do Not Disturb, grab a glass of water or a cup of coffee, sit back and enjoy. So welcome to the podcast, Sean.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and hello to everybody.
Fantastic. And where do we find you today? Where are you today?
I am in Malawi today, and that is home. For the benefit of those who may be African but still don't know quite where Malawi is, it's a little landlocked country in southeastern Africa, bordered by Mozambique, Zambia, and Tanzania.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for the geography lesson. It's a great place to start. So let's start by talking a little bit about the environment we find ourselves in. So you're used to being a very hands-on operational person, you know, COO at Africa World Airlines, very operational in the roles that you've held previous. And now, obviously, whether we like it or not, we're living in this crazy virtual Zoom-dominated world. You know, how are you finding living in that? Has it come naturally, or has it been a bit of a challenge?
You know, even though I'm not technically on the ground and hands-on right now, I'm still actually keeping busy. And it's ironic because I've gone from having, 100% focus, which was, Africa World Airlines at the time, to now having my fingers in multiple different pies. So I've probably got around 6 projects running right now. And, that's 6 different things to keep me busy. So it's definitely, not a quiet life. I've actually had a bit of experience working remotely. Before I came back to AWA in 2018, I was with SKA Group, and part of what I was doing there was I was running some of our UAE operations and our Uganda operations remotely from Malawi. So I knew it was something that I could make work from Malawi. The internet is decent enough. Modern communications are decent enough. And of course, wife first and dogs second are here. So, that obviously makes it a lot better than being out in the field during a pandemic. So I'm fairly happy with the situation, the way things are going.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. And we've got to be pragmatic. We don't really have a choice anyway, do we? So, you've got to make the best of what you've got. So first question then is, how would you rate African aviation's response to the pandemic?
Honestly, I think African aviation in particular has responded among the best in the world. I think African airlines and African, obviously, regulators and other stakeholders recognized both the need to implement precautions against COVID early, and that sometimes took the form of shutdowns for a short term and so forth, but also the need to reopen and keep the economies moving. And this may have been driven by necessity. You know, African countries don't have the resources to be social welfare states and so forth. So, you know, the economy's got to keep moving along. But I think aviation benefited from that. And I think even for border openings, testing, pre-flight testing, 72-hour prior PCRs, testing on arrival, and so forth, began to be implemented by African countries as far back as June 2020, and in fact became the de facto standard in over 40 countries in Africa by October. But it's only this month that we're seeing the so-called advanced countries, the US, the UK, European countries, and so forth, beginning to implement this testing. And I think Africa really took the lead in that. Africa showed that you could use aviation in a pandemic situation as a tool to keep the economy moving safely. I think African aviation has set the right tone for this. Certainly, vaccines are going to take a lot longer to come to Africa, which may have forced the hand as well. You couldn't really say we're going to wait till 2023 to vaccinate 90% of our population, because that is the reality in most parts of Africa. So I think that in cheaper and more reliable testing options are going to be a bigger game changer for African aviation to come through the pandemic. And Africa has taken the right steps so far by opening up borders and by developing safe ways to travel by air during the pandemic, which don't necessarily have over-reliance on magic vaccines at some unknown point in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because it seems to me, living here in Europe, that all the countries are kind of really racing to get people vaccinated, and almost saying any travel during that time is almost unacceptable because it runs some form of risk. Whereas, like you say, in Africa, there's been a testing regime pretty much across the board. The challenge is that the passengers are paying for those tests, so it's adding that cost, it's adding the complexity for the airports. The airlines as well are having to sort of deal with all of this. So you're seeing that actually the medium term here, let's not hold, we can't, like you say, you can't hold out for a vaccine if it's going to take another 2 years to really sort of take hold and be proliferated on the continent. So it's going to be a whole raft of, let's focus on getting the testing more efficient, cheaper. That's kind of the way forward for the next couple of years, you think?
I definitely think it's the way forward for now. I don't think a single country in Africa has really rolled out vaccines beyond trial phases and so forth. So, we're talking. I mean, when I read the various news in the different African countries that I follow, local news, it's unlikely that most of Africa will even see their first vaccines until the middle of this year. And then if 70 or 80% is your target to achieve herd immunity, you're looking at a year at least. And I mean, that puts you in the middle of 2022, and you cannot shut down African economies for that long. African economies, I think, have shown that any shutdown longer than a week to 2 weeks, because of the number of people in the informal sector, because of the need for, because the states simply don't have the resources to continue subsidizing a social welfare state. And Africa had to find a solution, and Africa used science and used common sense to come up with a homegrown solution, which was pre-flight testing and, in some cases, on-arrival testing. And honestly, it's something I'm very proud of in terms of what was achieved in Ghana. And yes, we were one of the stakeholders there, so we'll take some of the credit, although not by no means a major part of it. But the intention was, and this is from Ghana Health Service, when the borders were reopened in September of 2020, was that you're never going to catch every single case coming in. If you're looking for an Australia or New Zealand zero tolerance policy, it's going to come at a tremendous cost, which you cannot manage. And there was going to be community transmission, and the community transmission would continue at presumably whatever the rate was. As long as your import rate, the rate at which you're bringing new cases into the country, is lower than your community transmission rate, you're not really taking a risk, because you've got as many people going out of the country as you have coming into the country. So there's just as likely for someone who has been tested and has false positives, false negatives within the community, taking a case out as you have of a case coming in. And that evens out in the main, in the long term. And in Ghana, these figures, certainly, they're through till, I think, end of October, give or take. But effectively, it was 99.7% efficient with the double test protocol, which is a PCR test 72 hours prior to departure, followed by a rapid antigen test on arrival in Accra. And between that, effectively, it was just 3 in 1,000 cases who were subsequently found in the community within 2 weeks of arrival of testing positive. Certainly, there were lots of people caught at the first test stage. There were people who were caught on arrival, but that's what the system is set to catch. You're never, by saying, oh, we caught people when they arrived at the airport, oh my God, we have a problem. You don't. That's actually what the system is set up to catch. So if you're catching the right cases, getting them into medical care, you're actually helping the community, because this got more and more people into testing regimes who would otherwise be sitting at home and not doing it. So I'm a firm believer in testing. And of course, right now, as you said, testing is expensive. That adds another burden to people traveling, especially, within Africa, where airfares and taxes are so high already. But, cheaper and more reliable testing. If you get test accuracies up to 98, 99%, and you get them down to, $10 and $15 a piece, you will see a very good recovery for intra-Africa traveling, at least, very soon.
Yeah, and perhaps that cost could be offset with some sort of support from a government somewhere, so that the passenger doesn't take that cost. I see you smiling. I know I live in this fanciful world. So you're not here as our health correspondent necessarily, although it's dominating all of our conversations. I'm sure everybody on the call today is having. Every single one starts with, how is it with you? What's happening in your country, etc. Because it really is, it is the number one priority. But I guess what I wanted to ask from an African aviation perspective is, how would you rate the association's effectiveness, and how could they do more to support the industry in the, in the current environment and what we're finding?
I think that very much depends on the different associations. I think IATA has done a very good job. IATA, because of its global nature, has been able to seek views. I was very vocal, definitely among the African members of IATA, in terms of stressing that testing regimes, or any regime, in fact, which does not involve quarantine, is probably critical. And I think IATA, and most airlines are maintaining that. And I think IATA has been very good in terms of providing resources to member airlines, resources to non-member airlines, resources to the public as well, in terms of understanding the protocols required for travel to different countries. This is constantly changing. And, IATA's travel centers and things like that are becoming effectively the industry standard already. I think IATA has already made a very firm commitment to developing the travel passports, the vaccine. I don't like the vaccine passport. Let's call it the travel passports, inoculations and testing and things like that, to be able to authenticate, these various services that will be required in the new normal of travel going forward. And I think IATA has done a really good job, even in communications. IATA member airlines had access to a huge volume of images, graphs, explanations, talking points. If you ever got a question from a minister, what do you think about this? You just go to the IATA, portal over there, have a look at what is IATA's position on this, and just say, hey, here you go. And, all the data and everything was well collated. On the flip side, there are a number of other associations which have illustrated why their time has passed. I think AFRA is a good example of this. I think AFRA has, unfortunately, over the last decade or so, become a mouthpiece for failed state-owned carriers, just lobbying for additional subsidy from their governments. And that is the reality. AFRA is a protectionist. They don't allow membership to people who don't meet whatever their arbitrary standards are. They are hypocritical. They call for abandonment of state aid for foreign state-owned carriers flying into Africa, but they want state aid for the African carriers flying to the foreign countries. And unfortunately, I think, you see from the membership there, the membership is dwindling, and I think the only people left at places like AFRA are the failed state-owned carriers. And even they'll die soon because they're not very good at lobbying for more subsidies. And I think that is the reality. So certainly IATA has come out of it a lot better off, in my view at least. And I think people like AFRA have just solidified their uselessness, with their lack of productivity during the pandemic.
Okay, and let's talk sort of again another agency that's tasked with something slightly different. It's 3 years to the month that I was in Addis Ababa for the signing of the Single African Air Transport Market. It was January 2018, the latest incarnation of the Yamoussoukro decision, and it's amazing to think that's 3 years ago. But now we obviously have AFCAC set up, headquartered over there in West Africa, with a team in place. If you were the head of AFCAC, how would you get SAATM started? And, what should they be doing right now or otherwise, I suppose?
Okay, I'm an airline manager, not a miracle worker. I think getting SAATM started is beyond something that a single person or a single agency can do. I think the biggest reason why SAATM has dragged is due to some countries being selfish. They want the benefits of SAATM without the reciprocity. And I think, again, this takes us back to the whole African aviation tends to be protectionist state-owned industries. And everyone wants an advantage. And I'll give you a good example of this, Kenya. Kenya is a country which claims to be very keen on opening up skies and everything, but at the same time, they are nationalizing their airline. They wanted to merge their airline and airports so that the airline could get a competitive advantage. And if you try getting permits for flying into Kenya, I promise you, and I'm sure there are many on this who have done this for charters, for schedule, for whatever else, it's nowhere near as easy as pretty much any other African country makes it for Kenyan airlines. And, there are people who want the advantages of SAATM without giving up the reciprocity. And every country that does this, you'll find another country, Kenya did that, so Tanzania got into a little spat with them and vice versa. And, this kind of tit for tat continues to happen. And until there's actually a commitment to reciprocity, with an understanding that reciprocity means you may win on one front, but you may lose on another front. And until the African countries and African politicians and African airlines, which are effectively extensions of government for the most part, are able to accept that, I don't think SAATM is going to really become widespread. And I don't mean to be pessimistic about this, but I remember the days when the Yamoussoukro Declaration was the big thing. And I went to BASA discussions and said, on the basis of the Yamoussoukro Declaration, we'd like, more rights. And some were willing, but most were like, oh, we are working on this. And then it became the Yamoussoukro decision. And we were like, on the basis of Yamoussoukro decision, we'd like to see more reciprocity and, more traffic rights. And the same thing happened. And now you've just changed the name and you're saying, now on the basis of SAATM, I want the same thing I asked for nearly 20 years ago. And we're getting the same responses that we're working on it. It's a process. It's slow. Change is not going to happen overnight, and people need to want to change for change to be effective. And unfortunately, I think that while some African countries, certainly some are, some have really embraced it, even if that may be in the short term hurting their own. But in the long term, that will benefit them because they will become the gateways, they will become the hubs, they will have the best air services out there, even if that does mean that their local industry may take a short-term hit because it simply wasn't competitive.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We advocated, and I heard, when Raphael Cucci was with IATA, he used to say, look, those who are ready, let's go. Let's not wait for unilateral, 54 countries to go, hey, we woke up this morning and we want to implement it. Everybody's got different amounts of skin in the game. You might have a national carrier, you might not. And you've got to look at that on a case by case basis. I feel that this conversation, when I heard that they did the IATA study back in 2014 now, the Intervista study, and that was a sample just to say, we could choose any countries, but we're going to choose 3, north, south, east, west. We're going to show the benefit, and this will be applicable to all of them. And then, of course, you hear, no, I want one done for my country, because they don't trust the sample kind of thing, the survey. And we know that, like you say, there'll be places you win, places you lose. What I've sort of been thinking and trying to challenge here is isn't now the right time while we have this hiatus to say it wasn't working pre-COVID, we were losing money. Why don't we now put in all the structures so when we build back, we create an environment that's enabling for private airlines, that's enabling for competition. And, you see in the news that Airlink is now the second biggest carrier in Africa, a private carrier, because of what it's done in the land grab that it's made over the last few months. So my question really, I suppose I'm getting to there is, do you think post-pandemic, whenever that is, or as we learn to live with the pandemic, they're going to be more private airlines starting up, or is the industry and the environment going to be dominated by national carriers, forever?
That's a good question. And, I'm going to say that I hope there are more private airlines, but I fear that there won't. I fear that many African governments will, in fact, many African airline managers who are incapable of running a commercial enterprise, and that is the truth, will use COVID as an excuse to milk additional funds out of their governments and therefore prolong the inevitable by extending a anti-competitive situation with state subsidies. And we've seen this. I mean, just in the last few weeks, I've seen Rwanda, I think it's taken 100 and something million euros in state subsidies. Air Senegal, I read a Jeune Afrique article just 2 days ago that they've taken 68 million euros in subsidy. Air Cote d'Ivoire, I think, had around 50 million euros in subsidies. And these are numbers that private carriers simply can't even contemplate. I mean, 50 million euros or $50 million is a ridiculously large amount of money for a relatively small airline, which was not making money to begin with, to need to now bail itself out and make itself so-called competitive for the future. It's not going to happen. But unfortunately, at the same time, for that very 120 million euros or whatever that Rwanda has got, a new player in the East African market who might have been willing to come in and take a risk, saying that, look, Rwanda is not doing well. They're losing money hand over fist, which they have forever. I mean, that's no secret of it. Maybe there's an opportunity, maybe they're weak, but they're not, because the state is subsidizing weakness. The state is subsidizing inefficiency. The state is subsidizing anti-competitive activity. And I think that is where the biggest problem comes in. As long as states are unwilling to enforce their own competition laws, are unwilling to let their free markets actually decide, you're going to see smart private investors. That's not to say you won't have enough idiots, because believe me, 9 out of 10 African airlines are started by idiots. But the smart investors are not going to come into the market. And as a result, you're not going to get long-term, it's going to be very difficult to get long-term resilient carriers, private sector carriers coming out of this pandemic, even though the opportunity will exist.
Yeah, and that sort of leads me on, to the next question. I'm going to ask you this in a second. How do you make an airline resilient? But before we go there, I totally agree. I mean, it's about, first and foremost, access to financing. If you're a private carrier, you can't just turn to the government and say, hey, can we have some money? Whereas if you're a state-owned airline, you can. And then there's always this worry, I think, for private investors that get involved. And we've worked with lots of startups, but I know how they would feel. They'd think, okay, there's a gap in the market here. There's X country doesn't have a national carrier. If we go in there, we can do this for the country. But what then happens is the country thinks, oh no, we should be doing this. And they start something up that competes. Now, you saw this in Ghana. We're not there with a national airline, but there was a letter of intent signed at Dubai Air Show last year. It's been talked about a lot. So I suppose 2 things on this. One is, how do you make an airline resilient? For those listening who want to get into this or are into it, how do you do that? And secondly, how do you deal with that situation where potentially a government could wake up and say, this could be a vote winner, let's start a national airline?
Okay, we've only got 35 minutes left, so I'm going to have to try and keep this brief. How do you keep an airline resilient in Africa, a startup in particular? And, I'm going to draw a bit on personal experiences here. So those who are fans of AWA or within AWA might see a lot of what I've said this before. But I think AWA is a good example of a private sector African airline which took the right decisions at the beginning, and as a result is reaping the benefits of it now. I think the first thing from a pure structural standpoint, and I've said this to multiple people who are on this, I see them in the chat there, is to avoid debt. The moment you start taking on debt to fund a startup airline, you are writing your obituary right then and there. Equity investment is critical, and I know it's very easy to say, but the advice I give, I probably have 2 or 3 people a month coming to me with a startup airline project and saying, what advice do you have for me? And usually my advice is take half the money that you were planning to spend on the startup and burn it, and keep the rest of it, and you'll still come out 50% ahead than you would if you started the airline. And the main reason for this is simply debt. People don't understand the cash flow requirements of airlines and the sudden cash flow needs. You may have a great operation, you may be doing very well, and then you blow an engine. And there you go. You've got $1 million, give or take, starting at $1 million cash requirement tomorrow. And if you don't have that cash available because you've got debt payments to make, because you're going to have to go and pull on a bank line of credit at 25, 30% or something ridiculous, these are existential threats to startups. And it's true anywhere in the world. The difference is that in Africa, you are paying 25 and 30% for debt, while in most of the world, you're paying 2 to 5% for debt. And going in with equity instead of debt is one of the first key things that African startups need to ensure that they have access to funding. Think of how much funding you need, double it again, and maybe you've got enough. The next,
yeah, go on. No. I was going to say, and the other thing is, don't any returns that you get, don't take them out of the business too early. Keep them in the business.
Absolutely. In fact, that was one of the other points I was going to make, is that you've got to have shareholders who are in it for the long term. And we're very lucky at AWA that all 4 of our major shareholders at AWA were actually not looking for short-term results. They, at a minimum, they were looking at 5 to 6 year profit windows, which of course AWA is able to beat and profitable from year 3. But the ability to simply say, look, there are good times today, there will be bad times tomorrow. And if we'd been paying dividends, and reducing our cash balance and so forth, airlines were shut down in the pandemic. This was a black swan event, which you had to have a nest egg in the bank. And because you had that, you were able to actually turn that around to continue making your essential payments during this time, but use that time as well to restructure. So I think airlines which did it the right way will come out of this stronger. But anyway, we're digressing. The second point is another one, which is a very key decision we made with AWA at the beginning when we started up, was you need to be able to develop a domestic technical talent pool. And again, this is something that I found many startups, in fact, most startups in Africa tend to get into. They want to start up quickly, and therefore they decide, we're going to get in expat managers, we're going to get in expat captains, we're going to get in expat first officers and so forth. And, this will give us the jump start to go from 0 to 100 in 3 months or whatever else. I think that's a big mistake. I think, at AWA, we knew that relying on domestic management skills for the most part, on relying on domestic technical skills would be a slower growth curve, but it would also be something that would hold us in good stead for the longer term. So back in we started operations in 2012. Prior to that, obviously these investments started being made in 2011. Rather than going out and hiring a bunch of expats and so forth, we targeted a significant, certainly there were expats, especially at the starting stages, you needed them. In fact, there still are some expats in there, but they're in very targeted and top level technical areas, whether it's in management, whether it's in flying, we have training pilots or so forth. But at the time, instead of spending all the money on that money was instead spent on hiring young Ghanaians. That was engineers fresh out of school, and we'd sponsor them, put them in, give them loans to complete their licenses, put them through type rating. Same thing with young pilots out of flying school. we invested actually bringing Ghanaian trainers back home. So our first chief pilot and director of operations was a TRI working Ghanaian, working with Saudia. And so obviously lured him back home to Ghana and targeted a lot of top management. Our head of engineering was with United, got him to come back to Ghana. Our head of HR was with Virgin, got her to come back in, to a Ghanaian carrier. And so this kind of investment back then really paid dividends, and especially during the pandemic when borders were closed, we couldn't rotate crews back and forth to Brazil or wherever else the expats would have been coming from. But we were able to run a full schedule effectively with domestic crew, whether that's captains, whether that's cabin crew, everything engineers was able to run with Ghanaian talent for 6 months effectively. And we had we've got 3 Ghanaian TRIs now at AWA. So recurrent trainings, everything was able to be done in-house. And that was the investment which was made up front, which, I know people have said, oh, AWA, after 9 years and you've only grown to 8 aircraft. But you know what? It's a much more resilient thing now because you've got we know that we can survive a pandemic and go forward. And it's also helped in terms of staff retention. AWA's turnover rate is very low. Staff don't leave AWA because they don't just view it as a job. You go out as an expat, you've always got one foot out the door waiting for a job in your home country to go back home. But if you have a job in your home country that may not necessarily pay as much as an Emirates or one of the big name, Chinese carriers or so forth, but you've got stability. And I'll say this as someone who chose to come back home 3 months ago, you cannot put a price of being at home and working at home. That's a value that is simply can't be quantified that easily. So I think making the right decisions at the startup and making the right decisions for the long term rather than short-term gains is the most critical thing that all startups, but particularly African startups, because the cost of making a mistake in Africa is effectively fatal.
Absolutely. And I remember this, from the first time that we met, and we were talking about fleet and stuff. And you were like, look, steady. We've got nice uniformity. We're growing. We've got what we need. Let's not get too excited. And there's a 145 up here in ERJ on my bookcase. But let's get to a couple of questions from the audience. So I've got a question from James Pearson, who's the editor of Anna.aero, who provides great
stuff.
Hello,
James.
Yeah, and you should follow him on LinkedIn as well. He's a really, really good analyst. And
I've known James for probably 15 years, give or take, back when he was an annoying college student. So yes, I followed him on Facebook, on everywhere. So yes, follow James if you haven't already.
Yeah, he's got this unique situation where he's both been in academia. He's also worked on the airport side. He understands the process. So he asks a specific question about East Africa, and we were chatting about this yesterday in kind of the little rehearsal that we were doing. But he asks, multiple airlines in East Africa were growing quickly pre-coronavirus. He doesn't say growing profitably, he just says growing quickly. And they had big plans. What do you think about their ambitions? I know there's quite a few over there, but if you could just do a little safari around East Africa for us and let us know what you think, that would be great.
I think there's one airline in East Africa, and that's Ethiopian Airlines. Everything else are a bunch of jokes trying to compete. And yes, unfortunately, that now is beginning to include Kenya Airways. I mean, if you have to write how not to run an airline thesis, I think you'd probably choose Air Tanzania as your best example of that. They speak of their strategy. I don't understand their strategy. I doubt they understand their strategy. Certainly, having nice, shiny 787s to run on twice a week domestic 45-minute hops to Arusha is probably a nice thing to have if you're a domestic traveler. But I cannot imagine that that's making sense to them. Going out and getting brand new A220s is all good and wonderful. But if you look at the utility on those aircraft, it's woeful. And that the debt payments in this aircraft doesn't go away. The need to connect Tanzania better doesn't go away. Was that something that was needed? I don't think they have an answer to that. Uganda, certainly, I think Uganda. I think Uganda. I'll speak a bit more diplomatically here because I prior to coming back to AWA, I was a account manager for a cargo operation in Uganda. So I've got a lot of people in Uganda CAA I know personally, but I think Uganda CAA failed the country in 2014 by the steps they took effectively to revoke every AOC following their potentially negative ICAO audit. And I think that set Ugandan aviation back probably close to a decade. And I think where they are right now is effectively where they would have been in 2015 if they had simply chosen to roll heads at the CAA and allow Air Uganda to restructure rather than, and remember, that was a private sector operation for the most part, funded by the Aga Khan. They chose to shut down a private sector airline and instead, nearly 10 years later, are just getting back on their feet. So while it may look like a good thing, you effectively have a CRJ operator trying to run a hub in Entebbe. Whatever they do, they're just doing what was already being done 10 years ago, and that was 10 lost years. So that's not a positive thing. And I think bringing in A330s, you've got to walk before you can run. You've got to run before you can jump. And there, it's not a 0 to 100 in 3 months. It's a 0 to infinity and beyond. They will fail. Unfortunately, that is the reality. The long haul operations will fail because they don't have a foothold in their regional operations first. Develop your regional operations to a point where you don't even have to be dominant, but you have to be competitive. And that is not an easy thing because you have so many other state subsidized carriers around you. You've got Air Tanzania, you've got Keki, which is effectively state subsidized nowadays. You've got Rwanda, which is the king of state subsidies, right? In just your bordered areas. And you've got Ethiopian flying 6 times a day to Entebbe with Fifth Freedom rights onwards to multiple places. I think Juba, Goma, multiple places there, all of which are potentially lucrative. So I think, these were bad ideas to begin with. I think they were executed even worse in some cases. I'll give Uganda Airlines some credit. I think they pleasantly surprised me with the professionalism they've been able to do in the execution, but that doesn't change the fact that they were overly ambitious. And I think the pandemic is going to make them more reliant on state subsidies, which, you live by the subsidy, you die by the subsidy. And African countries at some point, every African country is going to reach a point where they say enough is enough, and then that will die. And then a few years later, consultants will make money writing a business plan to restart the national airline, Mark 3, Mark 4, Mark 5, or whatever number you're up to by then.
Yeah, no, great. Thanks for that. And let's we'll stay in East Africa because I've had a question in from Nella, who is a former Fastjet and Rwandair pilot. So she flew the 319s for Fastjet back in the day, and then the 330s for Rwandair as well. And she's just finished her thesis all about East African aviation. So it's a relatively long one, but the question's at the bottom. So she just said, as I'm getting to grips with the environment in the East African community, I'm more and more starting to realize the enormous impact of the governments. And I think this goes across Africa, really. But failure to effectively implement measures, be it the common market, customs union, visa facilitation, liberalization, but also the distorted playing field they create by subsidizing government-run airlines for the sake of socio-economic growth. They're effectively pushing out private investment, perhaps even hampering that targeted growth in the long term. So her question is, why is it that with the enormous impact and control that governments and regimes have, why do we never discuss politics? We point at failing airlines for poor leadership, but actually quite often the leaders at those airlines are really they've been put in place by their government. So they need to, they're not really in charge. So, how do you square this? Because politics are inextricably linked, but how do we move that needle and how do we get the politicians to listen? I imagine there are no politicians on the call today, for example, and it's very hard to get them to come to our event.
Well, if you're willing to pay their hotel, travel, and per diem, I'm sure they would be happy to come to your events. But, that's the cost of politics in Africa. No, I think she's got a very good point. And I don't think, even necessarily saying this, certainly this is an Africa forum, so Africa is what jumps out. But I think that's true in any economically developing country, which is a euphemism for poor countries. And the simple reality is that governments are going to have a disproportionately high influence on business in the country, overall business and economic activity, simply because in the poorer countries, governments account for a much larger proportion of overall economic activity in the countries. And we are airline professionals here, and we have the ability to at least, if not make change, but at least speak knowledgeably of change in the airline sector and the best practices that airlines can follow for safety, for commercial, for basically for airlines to move forward and maintain global standards. We're not politicians, and quite honestly, if there was a way to improve African governance, so to speak, and that's across the board, whether it's corporate governance, political governance, and so forth, I think it would, the person who's able to do that will become the billionaire many times over legitimately, not the steal from your people billionaire that many African billionaires have gone that way. So certainly it is an issue, but it's a reality, and it's not going to happen for this generation. I think that a lot of this generation's leaders are still first generation post-colonial leaders. They're still living under the developing stage, the first steps of independence. They've not quite become globalized. They've not quite understood the need for globalization. And I'm an unabashed libertarian and globalist in this way. I firmly believe that there are far more benefits from globalization in the long term. As long as it's managed well. You can't obviously open up on day one to everything. You will be shut out of it. But to look at that as a long term rather than look at protectionism and tribalism and so forth, it's the reality. And I'm sure a political scientist or sociologist could comment as to why this is more the case in Africa due to tribal affiliations and national boundaries being drawn artificially by colonial powers and so forth. It may have a reason for that, but I think that from a practical perspective, as an airline person, you're not going to be able to change. You're not on your own going to be able to change a president that easily, but you may be able to change how that president wants his national aviation policy implemented. And I think that's what we should probably focus on more than the basic governance, even though the basic governance is the root of a lot of the issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, Clive's just put in the comments there, the average age is sort of 20 years old on the continent, but the average president or leader of an African country is sort of 64. So it's a huge thing to say you represent us or whatever it may be. Not necessarily that age is everything, but it's definitely a challenge. So I'm going to go quickly through some of the questions that we've had. So we've got some good ones here, and we'll work our way through as we'll do a little bit of a speedy round. We've got about 15 minutes left. So Philippe asks, and we've had a couple of people vote on this as well. Do you think, what's the way forward basically for the African airlines to cooperate? Because we're seeing lots of interlines signed predominantly between non-African carriers and African carriers, but there are some, Semair and Ethiopian this week. There are some coming through. Airlink, and we had Roger on the live podcast. He's signed so many with so many different operators. So what's the way forward in terms of sharing the benefits and working closer together? Is it just interlining? Is it joint ventures? Is it alliances? Is it code sharing? Or obviously it's a bit of a panacea to ask you that question across the board, but how would you be looking at this if you were an airline?
I think you've actually, you've highlighted something inadvertently there, which is just proving you've set me up very well for this. That the examples you quoted in terms of Airlink and Semair and this and that, you're just showing that when you take a inefficient state-run carrier out of the equation, the opportunities that the private sector, well-run airlines, and that's, Airlink is certainly well-run, jury's a bit out on Semair. I hope Miles is not here. But the opportunities come up for these airlines to break out from the shadow of the bully, so to speak. And, certainly South African Airways, friends of mine, they're close to my heart, but I don't think even the most passionate defender of South African Airways would say that it was a well-run airline. It was a badly run airline, and with every well-meaning attempt to fix it failed. It was time for private sector to be given the opportunity to step in and fill the gap. And I think certainly the private sector is doing that, at least in the domestic and regional area. Airlink, Semair, Mango, Comair, these guys are there. They were stifled, and now they've got a chance to break out and show what they're really made of, sink or swim. And I think, well, maybe not sink or swim, fly or be grounded. But I think they've really demonstrated what they can do there. I think the only limit on what African airlines can do in terms of partnerships is their imagination. You can follow the Ethiopian type model of setting up a franchise national airline in every small country that doesn't have a plane and wants one, and that's got its benefits. It's definitely a good airline in a box concept that you can put out there. But in the long term, and I think we've seen this from ASky kicking back a bit against ET, we've seen this definitely in Malawi with some of the issues that have cropped up. It's definitely been an issue in Zambia, which is what has delayed the launch of the airline there. And I'm sure it's true in others. These are the ones that I actually have some knowledge of firsthand. And ET will benefit from that, whether your airline wins or loses, or fails or whatever else. ET's management fees, ET's lease fees, ET's training fees, ET's maintenance fees are going to be paid anyway, and that means ET is going to make money out of it whether you win or lose. That's one model. That could be a model that for a small country which can't afford it can look at it. A win-win model is probably an ideal one, which is where and again, you look at the South African domestic operators partnering with the longer haul carriers, whether that's intra-African partnerships, whether it is extra-African partnerships. If you're Airlink, you need the feed from the tourists coming in to be able to take them onwards to the game parks and to the secondary destinations. And if your Lufthansa group, which is, I think, Airlink's latest one, congrats, Roger. If your Lufthansa group, you need the feed from people originating there to be able to get it. That's a win-win. And certainly, there are trade-offs. There is a lot of investment which needs to be put up into the technical solutions for this upfront, and I think that turns a lot of African airlines off. An interline agreement, even if you're a member of IATA META, the cost of doing an implementation of an IET is going to be in the $10,000 to $20,000 range, depending what res systems you're on. And people blink at that, but I promise you, $10,000 to $20,000 can be recovered in less than a month. With AWA, when we had a partnership with South African Airways, there was a bit of resistance. Oh, $20,000 up front to develop this. In 2019, I don't have the exact figures offhand, but I believe the incremental revenue, so this is not just pure revenue, this is just additional revenue that came from the South African Airways partnership, was over $2 million. And that was within 1 year of making a $20,000 investment. If you were in the stock market, you'd be hailed as, as the greatest guru out there. This is just common sense. If you're making the right decision for the right reason, and not all of these will pay off. Certainly at AWA, we had great hopes for partnership with Cabo Verde Airlines. And unfortunately, COVID came along and, not a single ticket sold on that, but we still had that sunk cost in there. And that's the reality of it. If you want to play it alone, you are going to be limited by your own resources. If you want to become a global player and partner, you're only going to be limited by the state of the world economy. And somewhere in the world, there's always going to be an upturn, no matter how bad the rest of the world is doing. So go out there, don't be afraid to partner, and be imaginative as to what kind of partnership you want. Chances are, if that benefits you and your partner, it's something that you'll be able to put together.
Yeah, brilliant. And I do think this is one of the silver linings, because we've heard so many of these agreements over the last few months that people are finally, looking at that, and it's been driven. And like you say, the South African domestic market, SAA is not there, but you've got a new airline in Lyft. You've got Safair, which was already huge and is taking up. There really isn't space for that carrier anymore. Just not needed, because that connectivity is being provided. We're going to be doing, in the next 6 weeks or so, we're going to do a session on virtual interlining. So, step one in this whole process, utilizing technology to align schedules to make sure you can work together. So keep abreast of that. I want to come to MRO, because a good friend of ours, Dahir Mohammed from, he's actually dialing in from Long Island, New York. So it's very early for him in the morning. And he's asked us, what do you think about MRO in Africa and the progress to the future? And I know this is because he's really passionate about MRO and maintenance, repair, overhaul being done in Africa, not being done elsewhere, and even bringing companies that want to get their MRO done, bringing them to Africa to get it done. Let's invert the process, not just do it in Africa. Have we got the right amount of skilled technicians to be able to do that, the cost of doing it, etc. So what do you think about the MRO sort of future?
Future, extremely good. Current, the skill set is not there. And it's the same thing with training. There is no single place in Africa, with a few exceptions, certainly, Kenya, Ethiopia, South Africa, a few of these, the larger volume places, which have sufficient volume to be able to justify an MRO in those places. And the skill set, unfortunately, is simply not there for the pipeline, which needs to be there, because an MRO is part of a pipeline. It doesn't run as a standalone business on its own. It runs because airlines give them work. And I think a good model that Africa should look at for this is Latin and South America, which developed a lot of expertise in engineering, in many cases for the wrong reasons, to service their failing national carriers and so forth. But in due course, today have very qualified, very good technical expertise, which allows them to become attractive destinations for offshoring of maintenance capabilities. Today, I don't think that can happen in Africa. I think that African airlines themselves don't even have enough domestic talent to be able to run their line maintenance, let alone to be able to put in for third-party overhaul. There are very few exceptions to this, Ethiopian being one of them. Some of the South African carriers as well, but other than that, the local skills are simply not there. And I think before you can actually get to MRO and to AMOs, you need to look at training, because and I'll give you an example, Ghana. In Ghana, it is impossible to get a Ghana engineering license by studying domestically. They don't do it. There is no curriculum. There is nothing. To get a Ghanaian engineering license, you must do an FAA or an EASA or a course from elsewhere in the world, bring it back and convert it. Ab initio training in most African countries does not exist. And because of that, it puts the ability to train these engineers, to train these technicians in your domestic schools, because that is the key. Your most talented people, the ones who are going to be the backbone of your organization, are the ones who are not the children of the elite who can go abroad to study this, or the ones who are fortunate enough to get a scholarship or a loan, but rather are going to be the ones who are the hard workers, coming from often humble beginnings, because they work the hardest, they work the best. And I alluded back to this in the AWA discussion, and the reason why AWA has become resilient is because we invested in those. We invested in the best and the brightest of the domestic talent. And I think that's the expansion of something like that on a much larger scale is going to be the key to be able to develop an MRO. And Ethiopian has done that. Ethiopian Training Academy is probably the best in Africa right now, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, for developing talent, not just from Ethiopia, but internationally. But that is the first step. As that talent matures, as that talent gains experience, gains skills, that talent can then be used to set up the MROs. But we're probably 10 to 15 years away from having a competitive African MRO scene across the entire continent. At least 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, great. So I hope that answered the question, because Philippe asked about that as well as Dahir as well. Before we've only got 5 minutes left, and before we go, I did want to do a big shout out to our Thai provider.
Hey.
So Akpay is the lady. Akpay's Designs. You can follow her on Instagram. Sean is wearing his because he's our long-standing quiz champion for the AviaDev aviation quiz. There'll be some more episodes of that coming up, and you can win prizes. And my tie as well is proudly made in Ghana by Akpay's Designs. So I just wanted to make sure I get a shout out. And I also promised somebody that from a blast from your past, from your plane spotter past, Alex Howarth, who I think may be on the line, even though he's in Melbourne, Australia. He asks a bit of fun to sort of finish and then we'll do a bit of a serious question towards the end. He said, what's the most challenging place you've contended with, Mogadishu or Liverpool?
I will say that while Mogadishu may be challenging in a physical safety context, understanding the accent was a lot harder in Liverpool.
Very, very diplomatic. That is wonderful. So coming back to something a bit more serious then. So looking into the future, if you could change, because there's a couple of things, if you could change 3 things about African aviation, just 3, not 300, just 3, but what would be the top 3 things that you would change as a priority right now, so that we are in a position, we've got the foundations built to build back better, to quote Mr. Biden over there in the US?
Okay, I'll keep this very short by just naming the points. Number 1, more strategic partnerships. And by strategic, I mean actual partnerships which benefit both sides, not just an interline agreement with Ethiopian Airlines. So that's 1. 2, easier access to capital. And this may not be something that airlines themselves can do, but it's something that is going to be critical for the airline industry. If you have access to capital on global terms effectively, and certainly that's not going to be easy because the risk in Africa is a lot higher, but if you have access to capital on global terms, it'll really give a boost to African aviation. And finally, and this is a dark horse one, I think it is a focus on more agile distribution systems. I think the legacy systems, and I think someone mentioned it here, Clive mentioned it, that the average age of an African citizen is 19 and 20 years old. And I think that is the key to it. And I think that is the key to success in the next decade of African aviation, is that the growth in African aviation is going to come from the bottom end of the market. It's not going to come from the top. It's not going to come from business travelers and the high-end business travelers and government spending on business class tickets and so forth. It's going to come from the bottom end, which is new consumers. That is the fresh graduates from college, the newly empowered consumers, the newly empowered middle class spending more on it. These people are much more globalized. They've grown up in a globalized economy. They're used to using e-commerce, smartphones, and things like that. They are not as keen on having to, if you want to buy a ticket, they are not going to be the ones who go to a travel agency and where a travel agency types in on GDS and does that. You need to be able to do web sales. You need to be able to do web fulfillment. There's a lot of places you can book online, but the ability to pay, whether it's by mobile money or by domestic cards, is still not available. And the ability to get a more agile distribution to cater to the sections of the market where the growth is going to come from is what's really going to set the winners and losers apart in African aviation over the next decade. Those who can do that, who can market to them through social media, through more agile campaigns rather than traditional newspaper ads and billboards, those people will win, while those who are stuck playing to the traditional market only, I won't say will lose, but will definitely lag behind.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, we saw this. It's about stimulating a new market. We saw this in the mid-90s in Europe and the UK with the open skies, but then you've got these airlines like EasyJet, Ryanair, £1 fares, and all these, these different ways of doing things. And the really exciting thing that didn't exist back then is the technological opportunity with all the ancillaries, people using apps, and I just want to book this, I'm going to buy the bare minimum. And actually, they know how to navigate these things because that's there in their life, isn't it?
There is absolutely no reason that a globalized African consumer, even though their spending power may be less, cannot mirror the behavior that has been successful everywhere in the world, whether it has been in India with low-cost carriers, whether it's been with AirAsia, whether it's been Ryanair, Wizz Air, Spirit. Every market around the world has shown that this is a successful formula. Why do we think, Africa is different? Africa is not different. Africa is different because the people who keep saying that Africa is different. Let the young generation who is not burdened by this colonial legacy of subservience almost, of saying that, those people can do that. The white man is good at that. We are here. We have our own way of doing things. That's nonsense. Africans are just as empowered and powerful consumers who can drive African markets. And let that happen. And when that happens, I'm very confident that Africa will be well poised to really take its place in world aviation as, if not a leader, but definitely holding its own.
100%. And it's got the population, and it also doesn't have the alternatives, the distances and the way that it's sort of landlocked. Aviation is the way to connect. So I think that's a great way to finish. Final thing before we let you go, Sean, short-term plans. Are you staying in Malawi? Can everybody send you their, they've all got sort of jobs to fill in the recovery? Are you open for those assignments?
Well, I'm still technically bound to AWA till at least March, so with an advisory, non-compete, and so forth. So I'm definitely not moving back into West Africa for a few months. My intention is to be here. I mean, the reason I chose to come back home was because it's home. And especially sometimes, being away from home for almost a year in a global pandemic puts that into a bit of perspective for you. So I think with today's modern communications with Zoom, I'm on Zoom calls with all over the world every day. And I think that the kind of expertise I have can actually deliver results in multiple places from being back here, at least in the short term. In the long term, right opportunity, right place, I never say never. I've worked in more countries than I can probably remember or name off the top of my head right now. So for the right opportunity in the right place, I'm open to a project, but home is Malawi, and that's where I am going to be for the long time.
Wonderful. Well, I want to say a massive thank you. We've had people join us from New York to Melbourne and everywhere in between. So you're a popular man and well liked and respected within the community. So on behalf of myself and our community, I want to say thank you very much. I'll doff the cap. Very good. Yeah. We don't want to see too much. You got to keep that hat on. You see, I should.
Well, that's the problem, because otherwise, the light tends to reflect off my bald spot at the top of my head.
Oh, so now you tell me. Now you tell me. Oh, thanks a lot. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, everybody, for taking the time to be with us today. That's all we've got time for. We're going to be back with another audience with very soon. If you've got any ideas as to who you'd like to put in the hot seat and like me to invite, then do drop me a line, let me know. We'll put this out as a podcast and a video next week. And you can connect with Sean, obviously, on LinkedIn and social media. You'll be able to find him. I'm sure most of you are already connected with him there. To make sure you keep updated of our activities, because we're obviously bound here to not travel at the moment, do visit the Aviadev Africa website, sign up to get the newsletter that we started to put out every week. If you've got anything for that as well, do reach out to us. We are here to obviously serve the industry. And as I said, the session will be available early next week, YouTube and all the usual podcast channels. So if you did enjoy it, please do share it with somebody you think would benefit from having a listen. That would really mean the world to us. Don't forget to subscribe to those channels, and we will see you for the next episode very soon. Stay safe, stay well, and we will travel soon and be together soon. Thanks again, Sean, and thanks to everybody for attending. We'll see you all very soon.